Ever wonder how Grandma made everything work with almost nothing at all? Her strange but useful cooking tricks turned scraps, grease tins, and old habits into quiet genius that kept every meal going. What did she know then that we've somehow forgotten now? Keeping brown sugar soft with bread was one of those kitchen tricks that made you shake your head at its simplicity. When the canister of brown sugar started to harden into a brick, Grandma never panicked. She just tore off a small slice of bread and tucked it right inside the container. By morning, the sugar had softened again, soaking up just enough moisture from the bread to turn back into those soft, molasses-colored crystals. The bread itself would dry out completely, sacrificing its freshness to save the sugar. It was a quiet little miracle of home economics, the kind that made sense only when you lived through days when waste was not an option. She never explained it, she just did it. And somehow it always worked. No gadgets, no replacements, just a slice of bread, a canister, and patience. It was that kind of practical magic that made her kitchen seem alive, like everything in it had a purpose. Years later, when brown sugar clumped in your own cabinet, you would think back to her calm hands and that small piece of bread doing more good than most store-bought fixes ever could. Stretching milk with evaporated milk and water was how Grandma made sure the family never ran out, no matter how many bowls of cereal or cups of coffee needed pouring. When the fresh milk jug hit empty, she reached for a can of evaporated milk from the pantry. It was thick, rich, and shelf-stable, a small miracle in a can. She would mix half of it with half water, stir it until smooth, and pour it into the old glass bottle like nothing had changed. The flavor was a little stronger, the color a little creamier, but it worked. Kids never noticed, and if they did, she would say it made the milk heartier. It stretched $1 farther without anyone feeling the pinch. Sometimes she even used it in mashed potatoes or mac and cheese for a silkier texture. That small can of evaporated milk was her safety net, her secret to keeping the household running without a fuss. It was not about being cheap. It was about being ready. Grandma's kitchen was a classroom in quiet resourcefulness, where even the simplest substitutions carried the weight of care, foresight, and experience learned the hard way. Using potato water in bread dough was one of those old tricks that seemed odd until you tasted the result. After boiling potatoes for dinner, Grandma never poured that cloudy water down the drain. She saved it, letting it cool just enough before mixing it into her bread dough instead of plain tap water. The starch in the potato water gave the loaves a tender crumb, a soft bite, and a freshness that lasted longer than ordinary bread. It made the dough easier to knead, smoother under her hands, and it baked into something that smelled like warmth itself. Nothing in her kitchen went to waste. Not even the water. Every bit of it had potential, and she knew how to use it. That leftover potato water turned out to be the secret ingredient that gave her bread its staying power. When you sliced it open the next day, it was still moist and pillowy, just the way she liked it. People always said Grandma's bread had something special, but she just smiled and said, "It is the potatoes." Behind that smile was a lifetime of small lessons about thrift and flavor, proof that wisdom often hides in the simplest things. Reusing bacon grease for flavor was second nature in Grandma's kitchen. She kept a little metal tin on the back of the stove, filled with what she called liquid gold. Every time she fried bacon, she poured the leftover grease through a small strainer into that tin. Once it cooled, it solidified into a pale, creamy fat that carried the memory of every breakfast cooked before it. A spoonful could transform a pot of beans, a pan of greens, or a batch of cornbread into something rich and unforgettable. She used it for frying eggs, sautéing vegetables, or greasing cast iron pans before baking. Nothing wasted, everything reused. The smell of bacon grease warming on the stove was enough to make your stomach growl. It was the flavor of home, salty, smoky, and filled with love. Modern kitchens might call it unhealthy, but back then it was pure necessity and pure genius. Bacon grease carried more than flavor. It carried history, the kind of old wisdom that said flavor should never be thrown away. Preventing boilovers with a wooden spoon was one of those small miracles that never failed to impress. Grandma could walk away from a pot of soup or boiling pasta, confident it would not erupt all over the stove. Her secret? A wooden spoon laid right across the top of the pot. Somehow it stopped the foam from rising and spilling over, breaking the surface tension and keeping everything in check. You could almost call it magic, though she would just say, "That is how my mama did it." No gadgets, no alarms, just wood, heat, and experience working together. The spoon sat like a tiny guardian, keeping her pots neat and her temper cool. While others scrambled with towels and mops, she would smile knowingly, unbothered by the bubbling chaos that never came. It was simple science wrapped in generations of habit, one of those practical tricks that belonged in every kitchen. Today, it feels like a secret lost to time. But back then, it was just part of everyday life. Proof that Grandma's kind of wisdom did not need explaining, only observing. Reviving wilted lettuce with ice water and sugar was how Grandma refused to let a single leaf go to waste. When the greens looked limp and tired, she filled a bowl with ice water, stirred in a spoonful of sugar, and let the lettuce soak. After a short rest, the leaves came back to life, crisp, green, and good as new. It was like watching a small resurrection happen in her kitchen. Instead of throwing food away, she gave it another chance. No one ever left her table without salad, even if the greens had started to wilt that morning. The trick worked every time, saving both money and pride. Grandma knew that freshness was not always about what you bought, but how you cared for it. She handled every ingredient like it mattered, whether it came from a store or her own backyard. Reviving lettuce was not just about saving food, it was about respecting it. That bowl of ice water reminded everyone watching that waste was a choice, and Grandma never made that choice. Flooring raisins. Before baking was one of those tiny details that separated Grandma's baking from everyone else's. She never rushed through recipes, she respected them. Before stirring raisins into a cake or loaf of bread, she rolled them lightly in flour. It looked fussy, but it made all the difference. The flour kept the raisins from sinking to the bottom while baking, spreading them evenly through the batter instead. Each slice came out perfect. No clusters at the base, just sweet, chewy bites from top to bottom. It was a trick passed down quietly through generations, never written, only shown. Watching her work was like watching patience itself take form, precise, deliberate, and calm. She believed that good food came from care, not shortcuts. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and butter, and her hands moved with certainty, the way only years of practice can teach. Flouring raisins was one of those small, invisible acts of love that made her baked goods taste like memory itself. Using cornstarch to iron shirts was proof that Grandma's kitchen was her laboratory. Cornstarch, the same white powder she used to thicken gravy, became her secret weapon on laundry day. She mixed it with water, poured it into a spray bottle, and misted it over freshly washed shirts before pressing them with a hot iron. The result was perfection. Crisp collars, smooth sleeves, and that faint, clean scent that followed you all day. It was cheaper than store-bought starch and worked even better. No one questioned how she always looked so put together, even when times were tight. The trick was simple and effective, born from necessity but carried out with pride. Grandma knew that thrift did not mean neglect. It meant finding ways to make ordinary things extraordinary. The sound of the iron steaming across the fabric filled the room like a quiet rhythm, the heartbeat of her steady care. A kitchen trick that made its way to the closet. It reminded everyone that her wisdom had no boundaries, only creativity. Saving bacon. Grease to seasoned cast iron was Grandma's insurance policy against rust and bland food alike. After frying bacon, she poured a spoonful of the grease into her favorite cast iron skillet, rubbing it around with a paper towel until it gleamed. That pan was her pride, black and shiny from years of careful seasoning. The grease sealed it, kept it smooth, and added flavor to every meal cooked in it afterward. Eggs never stuck. Cornbread baked golden and fried chicken came out crisp and perfect every time. She never washed that pan with soap, just a rinse, a wipe, and another layer of grease. It was a living piece of her kitchen, passed down like a family heirloom. When she said, "You do not wash love off a pan," she meant it. Every meal carried a bit of history. Every scrape of the spatula echoed 100 suppers before. The cast iron was more than cookware. It was memory forged in heat and bacon grease. Keeping cake moist with an apple slice was one of those gentle tricks that felt like folklore, but worked every time. When Grandma stored her cakes, she always tucked a thin slice of apple into the tin before closing the lid. The apple's natural moisture kept the cake soft for days, preventing it from drying out. It was simple, invisible, and brilliant. No plastic wrap, no preservatives, just fruit doing what fruit does best. Every day she would replace the apple slice before it shriveled, keeping the cake as tender as the day it was baked. It was her quiet insurance against waste and disappointment. Guests always wondered how her desserts stayed fresh so long, and she would just smile and say, "A little apple never hurt." It was a secret born from observation, from paying attention to how nature behaves. Her kitchen was full of such secrets, ordinary magic that turned daily living into an art form. Grandma's tricks were never about shortcuts. They were about care, the kind that keeps sweetness alive just a little longer. Using coffee grounds to deodorize the fridge was one of those clever tricks Grandma swore by long before air fresheners came in plastic tubs. When the baking soda box ran empty, she would scoop the used coffee grounds from the morning pot and spread them in a shallow bowl. Then she would place it on the fridge shelf and close the door, leaving it overnight. By morning, every strange smell was gone. The onions, the fish, the sour milk. The coffee grounds soaked up every bit of odor and left behind a faint, warm scent of roasted beans. She said it worked better than store-bought deodorizer because it was real, not made from chemicals. Once the grounds dried out, she would toss them in the garden or sprinkle them on flower beds, claiming they kept bugs away and fed the soil. Nothing went to waste in Grandma's kitchen. Not even yesterday's coffee. It was her quiet way of reminding everyone that everything had a purpose, even after its first use was done. These were lessons in thrift disguised as small acts of housekeeping, passed down through habit rather than words. Her fridge always smelled clean, not artificial, and somehow that small detail made the whole kitchen feel honest. Testing baking powder with hot water was Grandma's way of saving a cake before it failed. When a can of baking powder sat too long in the pantry, she would scoop a small spoonful into a cup and pour a bit of hot water over it. If it fizzed and bubbled right away, it was good to go. If it stayed flat, she tossed it without a second thought. No wasted eggs, no ruined cake, just a simple check before the baking began. She did not need fancy expiration dates or packaging labels, just a steady hand and trust in simple science. It was another small act of foresight that kept her kitchen running smooth. She never liked waste, and this test saved ingredients, time, and heartache all at once. The gentle fizz of the baking powder in water was the sound of assurance, proof that her next batch of biscuits or cornbread would rise just right. She might not have called it chemistry, but that is exactly what it was. Homemade wisdom disguised as instinct. Every time she baked, that little ritual reminded her that the best cooks were part scientist, part artist, and part magician. Breading meat with crushed crackers was the kind of trick born from necessity and kept for taste. When breadcrumbs ran out, Grandma reached for the sleeve of saltine crackers in the pantry. She would crush them with a rolling pin, not too fine, leaving little pieces for extra crunch. Those crumbs clung to chicken, pork chops, or even fish just as well as store-bought breading, sometimes better. The crackers soaked up seasoning beautifully, turning golden and crisp in the skillet. What started as a way to save money became her signature touch. The sound of the crackers crunching under her rolling pin was almost as comforting as the sizzle that followed in the pan. She never apologized for substitutions. She made them proudly. To her, cooking was not about following rules, but about making do and making it work. You could always tell when Grandma had fried something with crackers. The crust had that perfect balance of salty bite and homegrown ingenuity. Even decades later, nothing tasted quite like it. She called it the poor woman's panko, but truth be told, her version was richer in both flavor and spirit. turning leftover coffee into iced drinks was how Grandma proved that not a single drop deserved to be poured down the drain. Every morning, after the last cup was poured, she would set the pot aside to cool. Later, she poured it into glass jars and stored it in the fridge, ready for a new life by afternoon. Mixed with a spoonful of sugar, a splash of milk, or a bit of vanilla if she had it, that cooled coffee became a refreshing treat on a hot day. It was smooth, sweet, and far better than anything bought in a bottle. Sometimes she even froze it in ice cube trays to chill future drinks without watering them down. For her, coffee was both fuel and comfort, and she treated it like treasure. Waste was never allowed in her kitchen, not even in liquid form. Every sip carried the memory of her early mornings, the sound of the percolator, the hum of radio music, the quiet start to another long day. What others might have tossed, she turned into something worth savoring, a chilled reminder that a little imagination could stretch joy far beyond its first purpose. Greasing pans with butter wrappers was the kind of thing you did automatically once you had seen Grandma do it enough times. Whenever she finished a stick of butter, she never threw the wrapper away. Instead, she folded it carefully and tucked it into a dish by the stove. The next time she needed to grease a pan, she pulled one out and ran it along the metal surface. There was always just enough butter left clinging to the paper to coat everything evenly. Cookies, cakes, and cornbread slid right out, golden and perfect. It saved money, saved waste, and added that subtle buttery flavor no spray could imitate. Watching her smooth the wrapper over a baking pan was like watching a small piece of genius in motion. Nothing was wasted, not even what most people never noticed. Her kitchen had no space for shortcuts, only cleverness born from years of experience. She did not call it recycling, she called it common sense, and in a way it was simple, quiet brilliance wrapped up in wax paper, passed from one generation's fingertips to the next. Keeping pies flaky with vinegar in the crust was one of Grandma's most trusted secrets. When she made pie dough, she added a single spoonful of vinegar to the mix, just enough to keep the gluten from toughening the crust. The result was always the same: flaky, tender, and full of that homemade charm no store pie could touch. You could hear it crackle slightly as you cut the first slice. She never measured precisely, just poured until it felt right, her instincts sharper than any recipe. The vinegar's scent vanished in the oven, leaving behind only perfection. She claimed she'd learned the trick from her mother, who said, "Vinegar keeps the dough humble." It was chemistry disguised as tradition, a way to make something simple taste like mastery. Grandma never explained why it worked, and no one ever questioned her. Every pie she baked, apple, pecan, or sweet potato, carried that hidden touch, invisible but unforgettable. Even now, when you taste a crust that melts on your tongue, you remember that tiny splash of vinegar and the hands that poured it without hesitation. Cooking bacon in the oven on a brown paper bag sounded risky, but worked like a dream. Before foil and fancy racks became kitchen staples, Grandma lined her baking sheet with a flattened brown grocery bag. She laid the bacon strips neatly on top and slid the pan into a moderate oven. The paper soaked up excess grease while the bacon cooked evenly, curling less and crisping more. It smelled heavenly, filled the house with warmth, and saved the stovetop from a mess. When it was done, she just tossed the greasy paper, leaving behind perfectly cooked bacon and a clean pan. It was one of those tricks that belonged to a time when resourcefulness mattered more than convenience. She trusted her instincts and her experience, not packaging labels or gadgets. Bacon cooked that way had a different kind of crispness, one born from thrift and simplicity. It was the kind of kitchen wisdom that made people shake their heads today, but always worked back then. Grandma's brown paper bag bacon was the proof that good results often come from unexpected tools. Freezing herbs in ice cubes was Grandma's way of keeping summer alive long past the harvest. She would chop basil, parsley, or dill and pack them into ice cube trays, covering them with water or broth before freezing. Once solid, she stored them in jars or bags, ready to drop into soups and stews during winter. Each cube released a burst of flavor that tasted like sunlight in the middle of cold weather. It was preservation without waste, without gadgets, and without fuss. Her garden was small, but she treated every sprig as precious. Nothing made her prouder than seasoning a pot of soup with herbs she had saved herself. It was both practical and poetic, a quiet defiance against scarcity. Those little cubes were like memory frozen in time, proof that foresight and patience could stretch a harvest for months. Even now, when freezers hum with store-bought produce, that simple trick stands as a symbol of her ingenuity, her love of freshness, and her refusal to let anything from her garden go unappreciated. Soothing burns with cold milk was Grandma's first instinct before store shelves filled with ointments and gels. If someone brushed against a hot pan or stove, she would pour cold milk into a shallow bowl and gently dip the burned skin. The relief was almost immediate. The milk's fat and coolness worked together to calm the sting and keep the area from blistering. She would sit with you at the table, holding your hand in that bowl of milk until the pain faded. There was no panic, no rushing, just care and calm in her every movement. Sometimes she whispered stories to distract you. Other times she hummed an old tune. She believed the kitchen that caused the hurt could also heal it. And she was right. It was simple, natural, and full of the same patience she carried into every part of life. The milk trick was not science to her. It was compassion made visible, proof that love and practicality often worked hand in hand. Cleaning copper with salt and lemon was Grandma's quiet rebellion against store-bought polish. She would cut a lemon in half, dip it in salt, and rub it over the dull copper pots until they gleamed like new. The smell was sharp and clean, the sound of scrubbing rhythmic and steady. Within minutes, the tarnish melted away, revealing the warm glow of the metal beneath. No gloves, no chemicals, just nature doing what it was meant to do. She always said, "If you cannot pronounce it, do not use it," and her copper shone brighter than any modern cleaner could achieve. The combination of lemon's acid and salt's grit made for the perfect natural polish, passed down long before products promised miracles. Watching her clean was like watching history repeat itself, slow, deliberate, and graceful. Her cookware sparkled, her hands stayed strong, and her lessons stayed forever. The simplest solutions are often the best. Adding a pinch of salt to coffee grounds was one of Grandma's secret touches that no one else seemed to understand until they tasted it. When she brewed her morning pot in the old percolator, she sprinkled just a pinch of salt over the grounds before the water started bubbling. It seemed odd, but the difference was clear in that first sip, smooth, mellow, and free from the bitterness that sometimes came from strong coffee. The salt did not make it taste salty. It simply took the edge off. She said it calmed the coffee, like a gentle hand on a tired morning. Back then, there was no flavored creamer or fancy roast, just plain coffee, dark and honest. Her little trick made it taste like comfort in a cup. Even when the beans were cheap or old, that pinch of salt worked magic, turning something harsh into something worth savoring. It was small gestures like this that defined her kitchen, quiet, practical, and full of care. Every pot brewed that way smelled like sunrise, sounded like the rhythm of her spoon stirring in sugar, and felt like home before the day had even begun. Thickening soups with mashed potatoes was Grandma's way of saving a thin dinner without wasting a thing. When a pot of soup looked more like broth than meal, she reached for leftover mashed potatoes from the night before. A few spoonfuls stirred in slowly transformed the pot from watery to hearty, thickening it into something rich and satisfying. The potatoes gave it creaminess without milk, weight without flour, and flavor that belonged to home cooking. Sometimes she even used instant potato flakes if that was all she had, and no one ever knew. It made vegetable soup feel like a feast and stretched leftovers into another day's meal. There was no fuss, no measuring, just instinct and trust in experience. The result was always comforting, a reminder that no mistake in the kitchen had to stay that way. It was not just about fixing food, it was about making do with what you had and doing it gracefully. That humble trick turned her soups into legends of thrift and taste, proof that even leftovers deserved love. Refreshing stale bread in a damp paper bag was one of those small miracles that felt like alchemy. When yesterday's loaf went tough, Grandma never threw it out. She dampened a paper bag, slipped the bread inside, and set it in a warm oven for a few minutes. Steam filled the bag, softening the loaf until it tasted fresh again. The crust regained its crispness, and the inside turned tender, as though it had just left the bakery. It was quick, waste-free, and foolproof, the kind of wisdom you only learn when every penny counts. She never said it was saving money. To her, it was saving dignity. Bread was sacred in her house, never to be wasted, always to be renewed. The oven timer ticking, the smell of warm bread filling the air, those moments taught patience and appreciation in the simplest way. When you bit into a slice revived by her method, it was not just bread you were tasting. It was memory, respect, and the quiet genius of someone who could make yesterday feel new again. Saving bacon. Drippings for gravy base was practically a religion in Grandma's kitchen. After frying bacon, she never poured the grease down the drain. Instead, she strained it into an old jar kept beside the stove, its contents a soft, savory gold. When it came time to make gravy, she scooped a spoonful into the skillet, whisked in flour, and watched as it turned brown and fragrant before adding milk or broth. What came out was silky, smoky, and rich, the kind of gravy that could make plain biscuits taste heavenly. Every Sunday breakfast began with that smell, familiar and grounding. Bacon drippings seasoned more than food, they seasoned life, adding warmth where times felt cold. To her, it was not waste, it was wealth. That one jar carried weeks of meals, each spoonful a reminder that good flavor came from care, not expense. It was one of those tricks that kept families fed, hearts lifted, and kitchens humming through thick and thin. Coating. Measuring cups with oil for sticky ingredients was Grandma's small stroke of genius. Whenever she had to measure honey, molasses, or syrup, she brushed a little oil inside the cup first. The thick, sticky liquid slid right out without clinging to the sides, saving time and frustration. She never wasted a drop, and cleanup was easy. It was a trick that seemed almost too simple, but it made baking smoother and sweeter in every sense. Watching her pour golden syrup that left nothing behind was like watching efficiency itself. Graceful, quiet, and precise. She did not read it in a book. She learned it through trial, error, and necessity. Her kitchen was a place where every shortcut was earned, not guessed. Even small things mattered, because small things added up to ease, comfort, and consistency. Every time you measure honey today, you can almost hear her voice reminding you, oil it first and let it glide. Reusing pickle juice for marinating was one of Grandma's thriftiest and tastiest ideas. When the jar of pickles was empty, she never dumped the leftover brine. That tangy liquid, filled with salt, vinegar, and spices, became her secret marinade for chicken, boiled eggs, or vegetables. It tenderized meat, added zest, and turned dull dishes bright again. Sometimes she even used it to soak onions before frying, giving them a subtle bite that made everyone ask for seconds. Nothing in her kitchen ended with one use. She believed flavor should travel, not die in a jar. The reused brine carried stories of sandwiches, picnics, and backyard lunches. When poured over new ingredients, it created something familiar yet different, an evolution of taste that belonged only to her. Her hands were steady, her methods simple, and her food unforgettable. Pickle juice marinating was resourcefulness turned into art, proof that in Grandma's kitchen even leftovers were full of life. Keeping ice cream soft with plastic wrap was a trick so clever it almost felt like cheating. Grandma hated when her ice cream turned icy in the freezer, so before closing the lid, she pressed a layer of plastic wrap directly onto the surface. It blocked the cold air and kept the texture smooth, creamy, and scoopable days later. No rock-hard chunks, no frostbite crystals, just perfect ice cream every time. She treated it like a small luxury, especially during summers when sweets were a rare treat. It was the kind of wisdom born from observation, not instruction. She noticed problems and solved them with what she had on hand. Plastic wrap, a freezer, and common sense were all she needed. To her, cooking and storage were part of the same rhythm. Care in preparation meant care in preservation. Each scoop afterward was a reward for paying attention, a reminder that good habits make good memories. Cooking pancakes on cast iron for even browning was a lesson in patience and precision. Grandma always used her heavy black skillet, the one that had fried everything from bacon to okra. Cast iron held heat steady, making sure every pancake cooked evenly with crisp edges and a golden middle. She would wait until the pan was just right, hot enough to hiss when a drop of batter hit, but never smoking. The result was perfection every time. No burnt spots, no soggy centers. She swore that pancakes made in anything else just did not have a soul. The skillet told a story with every mark and scrape, a record of breakfasts shared over generations. When you bit into one of her pancakes, you tasted not just flour and eggs, but history, care, and warmth. The heavy clang of the skillet on the stove meant comfort was coming. Making homemade whipped cream in a mason jar was both fun and functional. When electricity bills ran high or the mixer was broken, Grandma poured cream, sugar, and a splash of vanilla into a glass jar with a tight lid. Then she shook it, steady, rhythmic, and determined, until soft peaks formed. It took effort, but the reward was sweet and immediate. The cream came out airy and rich, tasting fresher than anything from a store can. Kids joined in, laughing as their arms tired from shaking, turning dessert prep into play. She taught that good things take effort, and effort makes them taste better. The clink of the jar, the rhythm of shaking, it was like music in her kitchen, a reminder that work and joy often share the same space. Reusing pasta water for sauces was Grandma's final secret for silky, restaurant-worthy dishes. After boiling spaghetti or noodles, she never dumped the pot down the sink. That starchy water, thick with flavor, became her secret sauce binder. A ladleful stirred into tomato or cream sauce made it cling perfectly to every strand of pasta. The difference was subtle but unforgettable, a texture that felt homemade in the best way. She said, "The water remembers the pasta," and somehow it did. Her sauces tasted fuller, smoother, and richer because she treated every drop as precious. It was not waste, it was wisdom, plain and simple. Reviving stale bread with steam was one of those tricks that felt like a small miracle. Teachers showed students how to wrap a stale loaf in a damp towel and place it in a warm oven. Minutes later, the crust softened, and the bread tasted fresh again. This was important in an era when nothing was thrown away lightly. Families often relied on bread for every meal, so wasting a loaf was unthinkable. Students realized that even something considered ruined could be saved with a clever method. It was thrift in action, but it was also comfort, because fresh bread made meals feel complete. At home, this trick often impressed parents who had resigned themselves to stale slices. The aroma of reheated bread filled classrooms, reminding everyone how powerful simple fixes could be. It was a lesson that showed food was never truly lost if you knew how to bring it back. Eggless mayonnaise cake proved dessert could still be indulgent when eggs were rationed or simply too costly to buy. Grandma whisked together vinegar, baking soda, sugar, and a generous scoop of mayonnaise which provided the moisture and richness eggs normally gave. The batter baked into a tender chocolate cake with a texture so velvety, nobody guessed its secret ingredient. Guests marveled at the depth of flavor, while children asked for second slices, thinking it was the fanciest treat they had ever tasted. This clever recipe turned pantry staples into celebration and showed that a little science and a lot of courage could outwit shortages. The cake became a family legend, baked for birthdays, church suppers, and holiday tables long after times improved because it was that good. It reminded everyone that love and ingenuity were stronger than any ration line, and that a missing egg never stood between Grandma and a perfect dessert. Crockpots were more or less the slow cookers of the past century, and they were extremely trendy in the 1970s and 1980s. You could pin their skyrocketing popularity on a lot of things, but most of it was that they aligned with the food norms of the time. Slow-cooked roasts and the like were becoming a daily aspect of people's meals once again, and besides that, people wanted to step away from hard and complicated cooking that required you to dedicate a lot of time to being in the kitchen and observing every little thing. Crockpots let you do that by just setting whatever you had on the stove and forgetting about it for a while as it slowly cooked, so you could tend to other work, chores, or just some much-needed relaxation time without any worries. One-pot meals also were some of the most widely consumed things people had, with stuff like casseroles and soups being a typical American lunch back then. Also, people really appreciated what it did for the flavor. The United States is largely a meat-eating country, and slow cooking really enriches the flavor of anything you are working with. Sprinkling flour on any kind of surface always helps with any kind of non-stick rolling. This is again another case of something being a natural barrier. The little barrier that sprinkling flour provides between the rolling pin and the surface of the dough does two important things for it. One, you reduce the overall friction, and two, you prevent the dough from sticking. Now, why does that happen? Well, dough, again, is made out of a lot of water, and that means it tends to become sticky when it gets rolled out. Flour, on the other hand, is really good at absorbing moisture. See, a lot of this is just pairing one thing up with something that's the opposite of what it is so that you can balance the side effects of using it. You use non-stick rolling for your dough, which naturally means you run into moisture issues. You use flour, which is really good at taking away moisture, with your dough that's producing too much. That barrier also works as a little powdery layer between the surface and the dough, and this really helps the dough not stick to the pan. Double-duty roast chicken was the ultimate lesson in using one bird for nearly a week of dinners without anyone feeling shortchanged. On Sunday, Grandma roasted the chicken with onions, carrots, and herbs, filling the house with aromas that drew every family member to the table. After carving generous slices for the main meal, she carefully saved every bone and leftover scrap. The next day, the carcass simmered into a rich golden stock that became soup or gravy, while the remaining meat found its way into sandwiches, pot pies, or creamy casseroles. Nothing was wasted, not even the drippings which flavored biscuits and vegetables for days. Each time the family sat down to another variation, they marveled that the same chicken kept giving comfort night after night. This practice was part art, part discipline, and entirely about love and foresight, turning a single purchase into a string of nourishing memories. How to make perfect hard-boiled eggs became a rite of passage in many home economics classes. The trick was all in timing and cooling. Teachers explained that placing eggs gently into simmering water, not a rolling boil, prevented cracking and overcooking. 10 minutes of gentle simmering followed by a plunge into ice water kept yolks bright yellow rather than gray. Students practiced peeling shells without tearing the whites, a detail that mattered when serving salads or snacks. It was one of those small skills that built confidence quickly. Eggs were cheap, versatile, and always available, making them the perfect classroom ingredient. The satisfaction of slicing into a neat, sunny yolk stuck with students long after. The point was not luxury, but mastery, showing that even the simplest food could be handled with care and precision. Hard-boiled eggs became more than breakfast. They became a symbol of patience and practice in the kitchen. Jell-O molds were a typical 20th century snack that let people get creative and fashionable with their desserts. You could use them for gelatin-based dishes or jelly bowls and cakes, and they were very common at parties and family gatherings. Of course, the kids in particular enjoyed Jell-O molds the most out of everyone else, even if they had no idea how to use them to shape the Jell-O properly. That is probably why every grandma always had some of these, though, so that when their grandkids eventually did come over, they could enjoy playing around with their food a little before. After all, they would probably get scolded for doing so at home. To be honest, most Jell-O mold brands got really popular in the 1960s in particular, as they became a convenient trend since Jell-O was also getting more and more popular. String is actually really good, not just for slicing your cake and your desserts, but for stringing up and trussing your poultry too. It helps keep the bird in a compact and even shape, which, as you may have obviously guessed, helps ensure that the bird cooks evenly too. Trussing your poultry with string helps to make sure that the bird is cooking evenly, because of the fact that it helps maintain the overall shape of the bird. The legs and wings stay close to the body instead of away, and this helps the heat travel overall a lot more easily throughout the bird. You get uniform cooking this way, which is always better as opposed to, well, ununiform cooking. The poultry really keeps its moisture too, which is always good because, let's be honest, nobody likes eating a dry bird. The tight packaging helps to make sure the moisture doesn't get away, and the meat overall stays a lot more tender and juicy. Trussing also has an unexpected benefit, but since the body stays tighter and more together, the presentation ends up looking better too. This is a part of why trussing your bird around Thanksgiving became such a massively practiced hobby across the United States. After all, when the occasion is special, you don't just want to make a good bird, you want to make it look pretty sitting there with all the toppings too. Then there's the stuffing, which always tends to kill everyone's vibe when it overflows. The aesthetic appeal of the bird, combined with how it just overall cooks a lot better and stays more crispy too thanks to the even baking, means that there's almost never a reason not to truss your bird. How to clarify soup broth was one of those seemingly small lessons that showed students the difference between plain cooking and refined cooking. Teachers explained that skimming foam during simmering and straining through cloth or fine sieves kept broth clear, golden, and appetizing. It was not about changing flavor, but about presentation and pride. A clear broth looked cleaner, more professional, and carried a sense of care. Students learned patience, hovering near pots and skimming off impurities with spoons, a practice that required focus. Some teachers even demonstrated the egg white trick, where beaten whites were stirred in to attract particles before straining. Families appreciated broths that looked as beautiful as they tasted, especially during holidays or when guests were expected. Clear soups were once a mark of skill, and students who learned the process felt they had taken a step closer to real cooking mastery. It was a reminder that home economics was not just about feeding a family, but about doing so with thoughtfulness and care. A bowl of clarified broth became a symbol of effort done right. Rendered bacon grease. Cooking captured every drop of smoky richness from the breakfast skillet and carried it into meals throughout the week. After frying bacon, Grandma carefully poured the hot drippings into a jar to cool and solidify into a savory fat that replaced butter or oil. She used it to fry potatoes, season green beans, or add depth to cornbread batter, giving everyday dishes a hearty flavor without extra cost. The jar sat proudly by the stove, a reminder that nothing was wasted, and that yesterday's breakfast could improve tomorrow's dinner. Friends who tasted her vegetables often asked about the secret ingredient and smiled when they learned it was simple thrift. The aroma of bacon-infused dishes made even plain vegetables appealing to picky children and brought comfort on lean nights. This practice honored the belief that every part of a meal could serve again, proving that flavor and economy often go hand in hand. The pressure cooker was first invented in the 17th century, but most people began associating it with the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when stews became extremely common. Commercial mass production of pressure cookers began around this time, with the first one, the MBG, made in a Chicago factory in 1930. Due to high demand from home chefs, including stay-at-home wives and grandmothers, these cookers quickly gained popularity in the market. You could reduce cooking time with them, and they used a lot less energy than most conventional methods. As a result, people really took to these neat little things. One of the best parts was that it retained two of the most important things about your food better than anything else, which was the flavor and the nutrients. Pressure cooking helped keep more nutrients in your food as it used less water overall, and the tightly sealed environment helped keep evaporation on the down low, and it was really good for handling tough cuts of meat. Cloth bags can actually help your cheese age just right, and I bet that sounds like a really weird mix to you, but it's as legitimate as a mix can be. The right conditions for aging all happen inside the wonderful confines of a cloth bag, so you have that for one. Basically, to age cheese and to age it properly, you need three different things. You need moisture that's regulated, and you need a lot of air circulation. None of that means anything if your environment isn't clean, so you need to be able to prevent contamination as well as you can. Moisture regulation is really important because as it keeps aging, then cheese starts losing moisture. Cloth bags, on the other hand, are made of really breathable material and help moisture to evaporate a bit more slowly so that the cheese doesn't get too dry. Cheese aging also helps keep air balanced since the cloth bag is really porous. All those tiny little openings help air to flow around the cheese, which you really need for the health of the rind. It helps for those helpful little bacteria and molds that you find on cheese to grow. Some of those microorganisms don't deserve to die in a heat death. They make your burger a lot better. Third of all, the bag itself just works as a natural barrier against any kind of dirty substance, insect, or material. All in all, you get a perfect vibe for your cheese. Freezing herbs in ice cubes was one of the preservation tips that showed how clever home economics teachers really were. Students were taught to chop parsley, mint, or chives, tuck them into ice trays, and pour water over them before freezing. Weeks later, the cubes could be popped out and dropped into soups, stews, or sauces for instant flavor. It was a way to make herbs last before freezer bags and gadgets made the job easy. For families with gardens, it meant no harvest went to waste. The lesson also showed how freezing locked in freshness and saved money. Students loved the idea because it felt like discovering a secret trick that even adults did not always know. This was not just about saving herbs. It was about learning to think ahead and make use of small resources. Home economics turned something that might wilt in days into something that could brighten meals for months. Stuffed bell peppers with rice gave Grandma a colorful way to stretch a handful of meat into a full family dinner without anyone noticing the thrift behind it. She halved bright green or red peppers, scooped out the seeds, and filled them with a seasoned mixture of cooked rice, diced vegetables, and just a small amount of ground beef or sausage. The rice absorbed tomato sauce and spices, making every bite satisfying while keeping costs low. Baked slowly until the peppers softened and the filling melded together, the dish emerged fragrant and hearty. Children loved the tender sweetness of the roasted pepper, while adults appreciated how a single skillet of filling could feed a crowd. It was a clever use of garden produce and pantry staples that turned what could have been a meager meal into something special enough for Sunday. Each pepper stood like a little edible bowl of abundance, proving that a careful cook could turn scarcity into celebration night after night. This led to households always having the chance to design their kitchen and eating space however they wanted, down to the forks, spoons, and bowls, and there was just a lot more variety than you would find today. If somebody said they were bringing out the fancy stuff, you could always be sure you would get some pretty-looking cutlery. We are quite sure that this is a universal human experience that everyone has gone through at this point, whatever corner of the planet you may be from. Sometimes you have to sew something yourself. You ask your mom where the supplies are. She points you to your grandmother, who enthusiastically pulls out a biscuit tin or container of sweets. Maybe you get a little excited and jumpy, as naturally everyone would at the sight of a free sugar rush, but when she pops the lid open, all you see are sewing supplies. Did you ever wonder why they did this? Pre-freezing pies really helps before you delve deep into that baking rabbit hole, and it's for two reasons. You get a much flakier crust, which I'm assuming is something you want, and the fillings also stay really even, which I know you want. So, there are some sciencey reasons behind why this happens, and we'll definitely be getting into them. But if you're here for the too long, didn't read the version, then basically, moisture control, temperature regulation, and it helps keep the fat. Now, for the actual explanation. So, pie dough has a lot of cold fat, and that's what helps make that really flaky texture in the first place. Pre-freezing helps to solidify that fact and make sure the fat remains as solid as it can be, and the fat hopefully maintains its structure too. Plus, when you usually bake a pie without freezing it, the soft, soggy, and moist filling can keep the bottom crust really soggy. And this is a problem because you always want a firm base for your pie. The cold temperature of a pie that's been pre-frozen is an entirely different ballgame, though. This helps slow the process down in the oven, and overall, the fat at the bottom of the dough solidifies before the filling has a chance to soften it up. The filling itself is also getting more set and firm, and that's because being frozen helps keep it in a solid state, which helps make sure that it cooks more evenly. So, just a small trip in the freezer can give your pie the pick-me-up it needed, huh? The proper way to cream butter and sugar was the foundation for nearly every cake and cookie taught in home economics. Teachers explained that beating the two together created air pockets, making baked goods light instead of dense. Students practiced with wooden spoons or mixers, learning that patience and thoroughness were essential. It was not glamorous work, but it was transformative once cakes rose fluffy or cookies spread just right. The sound of spoons scraping bowls became part of the rhythm of the classroom. Recipes that had once turned out heavy suddenly tasted bakery-worthy. Teachers reminded students that this one step determined the success of countless desserts. Families at home noticed the difference too, when their children proudly presented cakes that actually matched the pictures. It was proof that technique could be more important than ingredients. Creaming butter and sugar became a lifelong skill that carried into kitchens well beyond school. Carrot-stretched spaghetti sauce added natural sweetness and hearty texture to tomato sauce when meat was scarce or expensive. Grandma grated fresh carrots so finely they melted into the simmering pot, releasing color and subtle flavor that made the sauce thicker and richer. The carrots balanced the acidity of tomatoes and reduced the need for extra sugar, while adding valuable nutrition for growing children. Ladled over noodles or spooned onto crusty bread, the sauce tasted vibrant and full even with only a hint of meat or none at all. Family members marveled that such a modest addition could create a sauce as satisfying as any from an Italian restaurant. This simple act of grating carrots stretched both flavor and budget, turning a small harvest into a big meal and proving that vegetables could quietly work the magic usually credited to meat. Every plate served carried a reminder of careful hands and resourceful hearts. Butter curlers were another little trinket that saw a lot of use in most households, thanks to the simple benefits of life it would let you enjoy, like very pretty-looking butter. Some home chefs were much more focused on presentation, decoration, and maintaining the ambiance with the look of their food than others. They always had butter curlers handy because at formal meals or dinner parties, this elevated the entire mood because of how good it could make your food look. Homes that had hosting and entertaining as a priority always had curlers around, and nowadays some still use them because of the flexibility it gives you. With butter curlers, you could get more controlled and moderate curls of butter out instead of large spreads that really burned through your stock and had you running to the grocer's again and again. Storing herbs in an ice cube tray works incredibly well because it really helps to keep them fresh, at least as fresh as they really can be. The herbs are very fragile, and if you've spent a lot of time seasoning your food, this isn't something I need to tell you. The essential oils in these are pretty much non-existent the moment they come into contact with air, and that only starts becoming more of a problem the longer that exposure lasts. They don't do well with lighter heat either, which is why an ice cube tray works for 3 reasons. 1, it helps preserve their freshness. Okay, tell me why, right? Well, ice cube trays put a little roadblock in a neat and slightly annoying process I affectionately call oxidation, and that really helps to keep spoilage issues low. That's all thanks to the cold temperature helping the enzymes stay away from the tissues of the herbs, and in turn, the oils that are with them. 2, there's only so much space in a tray, so you only take out the amount of herbs you need, which helps you keep spoilage to a low anyway. 3rd, you always place these trays in freezers, away from any kind of light or heat, which gives the herbs the perfect environment they need to rest and chill until you need to take them out. Quick pickling cucumbers was a fun project that students loved because the results came so quickly. Teachers demonstrated how vinegar, sugar, and salt could transform slices into crisp pickles in just hours. Garlic, dill, or peppercorns could be added for variety, making the jars look as appealing as they tasted. This was not the long process of canning, but a quick trick that taught the basics of preservation. Students enjoyed tasting their pickles the next day, marveling at the flavor that seemed too strong for such a short time. Families at home welcomed jars of refrigerator pickles that added crunch to sandwiches or dinners. The lesson showed that not all preservation needed special equipment, just resourcefulness and a willingness to experiment. It captured the spirit of home economics perfectly. Simple ingredients, clever methods, and satisfying results. Pickling cucumbers this way turned an ordinary vegetable into something bright and refreshing without much effort at all. Cabbage stretch stew turned a single pot into a feast by filling it with hearty leaves that softened into silky sweetness as they cooked. Grandma chopped cabbage into generous ribbons and simmered it with potatoes, onions, and just a little meat or smoked bone for flavor. The cabbage released moisture that thickened the broth and carried the seasoning through every bite, making the stew feel far richer than its cost. Served with a slice of homemade bread, it warmed the family through long winters and made even the scarcest pantry look abundant. The scent filled the house, drawing neighbors who often brought their own bowls, hoping for a taste. No one left hungry because the pot always seemed to hold enough for one more serving. This humble dish proved that a simple vegetable could turn a few scraps into a meal worth remembering, and reminded everyone that real comfort often begins with the simplest garden greens. Grandmas thought that rolling pins were pretty essential to a good baking session. You could not go a day without seeing one be put to use, as it was just a very multi-purpose tool that helped in every way possible. You could flatten dough with them, roll out a pie crust or a tart crust, as well as the doughs for cookies. You could get cookie dough to a very precise thickness with a rolling pin, and many a wonderful batch of gingerbread, shortbread, and red velvet cookies, which were really popular back then, were rolled out thanks to these pins. In the hands of an amateur, they may not be the best tool, but in the hands of a veteran home chef that has been rolling and baking for most of their life, there was arguably no tool better than these pins. If you even needed to make croissants, puff pastry, or donuts, you could use rolling pins. And if you wanted to save a little on birthday costs by baking a cake at home, that was pretty easy thanks to a grandma who knew how to work a pin. Vinegar acidic. And that's not new information. Hell, even a fifth grader these days can tell you that. At least I hope they can. Anyway, don't worry, because I'm here to tell you all about why its acidity is a factor we want to really be appreciating with this hack. See, that acidic nature helps to loosen and dissolve the burnt surface that you see on pans, the icky black stuff that sticks and just won't go away. Acetic acid is actually pretty weak, and vinegar doesn't exactly have the highest concentration of it, but its reaction with the minerals you'd find in burnt food and grease is what's interesting here. The acid actually helps break these down through an acid-base reaction and dissolution. Now those sound like fancy science words, but it basically means that this stuff is really good at helping the burnt food or grease detach from the surface of the pan. It's because vinegar is really good at cutting through stuff like that, which helps it dissolve greasy substances. I guess you can salvage that pan after all, right? Reusing bacon grease in place of butter was a thrifty habit that teachers made into a full lesson. Students learned that saving drippings in jars gave them flavorful fat to use later for frying eggs, baking cornbread, or seasoning vegetables. It was a way of carrying taste from one meal into the next. Instead of throwing away what seemed like scraps, the grease became a kitchen staple. Teachers emphasized that this was not wasteful, but clever and practical. Many families had done the same for generations, and home economics simply gave it structure. Students saw firsthand how bacon grease added a depth that butter alone could not give. It was old-fashioned thrift wrapped up in everyday flavor, and it stuck with many long after. The jar of grease by the stove became a reminder of how simple tricks made the kitchen more efficient and flavorful at the same time. Applesauce cake offered a moist, fragrant dessert when butter was scarce or too expensive to spare. Grandma stirred thick homemade applesauce into her batter, letting the fruit's natural sweetness and gentle acidity stand in for fat while keeping the crumb tender. Cinnamon cloves and nutmeg filled the kitchen with autumn warmth as the cake baked to a deep brown. Each slice carried a gentle apple tang that needed little more than a dusting of sugar to feel complete. Families discovered they preferred the lighter texture and subtle fruitiness to heavier butter cakes, and often requested it even when butter returned to the shelves. Using apples from backyard trees or local orchards kept costs low and flavor high, which made this cake a symbol of both thrift and abundance. Served plain or with a spoon of whipped cream, it was proof that necessity could lead to enduring favorites and that Grandma's creativity sweetened even the leanest times. Cooking with canning jars is one of the most common things to do because they're built to do really well around high temperatures. People use it during sous vide, or to bake, or even when they're slow cooking. These jars are airtight, and their heat resistance really isn't a joke. You should look up how good tempered glass is when it comes to dealing with extreme heat, because it's literally the entire point of picking it out for the canning jars. The jars are usually heated to really high temperatures so that the food inside can be sterilized and preserved, and the glass actually expands and then contracts back to its original size and shape without breaking. This means you can place it on any source of heat, a stove, an oven, or even a pot of boiling hot water, and not worry about any glass exploding in your kitchen. If you cook with canning jars, then the context of slow cooking really is the best one to use them in. The airtight seal really helps to trap moisture in, which helps to boost the flavor of something by several levels. You also get some pretty even cooking since what you're cooking in doesn't have a lot of space, though that comes with some side effects like managing your portion or needing to cook a few more times than normal. Still, I bet you didn't know we could cook with canning jars, did you? Which of Grandma's clever tricks do you still use? Tell us below, like the video, and subscribe for more timeless kitchen wisdom.